On this channel, we talk about stars. Mostly Warhol superstars because I am obsessed with Warhol superstars, but also all kinds of stars. Old Hollywood stars, present day media stars, vaudeville stars, like literally any star I am interested in. And I'm also interested in stars, like literally stars in the sky, because I am obsessed with astrology and have been forever. And I also do astrology charts. So by the way, if you want me to do your chart, link will be in the description of this video. But my point is, I'm obsessed with stars. And on this channel, I do deep dives into all different types of stars. And over the last few months, I have been noticing something very morbid and very creepy and very weird. And it's that anytime I do a deep dive into a star, regardless of the genre, when we get to the end of the video, they have their funeral at the same place. Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel. From Jackie O to the notorious B.I.G. From Nicholas Tesla to Jiggly Caliente. All of these people had their funeral at Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel. And I started to pick up on this thread and I was like, what is going on? This is so weird. And then I dug into it and I was like, oh, actually, this makes perfect sense. And so today, we are going to dive into the extremely storied history of Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel. The place that you get buried if you are anyone who is anyone. This is your final resting stop. But before we get into all that, hi, my name is Kate and I am the creator of The Factory, which is an immersive theater show about the world of Andy Warhol. Basically, you as the audience are invited to a party at the factory where you can help silk screen paintings, sit for your own screen test, rock out with the live rock band, help film an underground movie, and maybe if you play your cards right, you will be named Andy Warhol's next superstar. I have been making these videos to raise awareness for the show, so I've been having a very fun time. We've been doing all these deep dives, and this one was not one that I was expecting to do. Literally, when I started making these videos, I had never heard of Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel, and now I am absolutely obsessed. So we're gonna get into all that. If I didn't mention before, I also am doing astrology readings now, so if you would like me to do your chart, click the link in the description of this video and we can schedule an appointment with the stars. But let's get into it because this video, wow, what a story. Please subscribe. I always forget to say that. It would mean a lot. I am so close to 2,000 subscribers and you might be the one to help me like inch over, so I would really appreciate that. Now let's talk about Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel. So, Frank E. Campbell was born on the 4th of July in 1872 in Camp Point, Illinois. And I don't know very much at all about his early childhood, but what I do know is that by his late teens, he was working at an undertaker's doing coffin making, essentially. And he finds that the funeral business is the business for him, and he decides to go to the big city and like make it in the big world of undertaking in New York. And so he moves to New York City. He starts working with undertakers there, and he, is doing fairly well for a 20-year-old. At the time, funerals were a very like low-key, small affair. You would have them in your home, so the person would die, they would stay in the home, you would have a small service at the house, and then you would load the deceased into the coffin. The hearse was drawn by horses, like horse-drawn carriages. It was all very like private and small. And Frank basically thought that it was super depressing to have a funeral at your house and like have all that death with you where you live. And so he thought it would be better to have funerals at like a separate place outside of the home. And so he had this idea of a funeral chapel, which like really hadn't been done before. And so he opens the very first, well, his very first funeral chapel. I'm not sure if it was like actually the very first, but it was one of the very early ones. Literally, as soon as he opens his funeral chapel on 23rd Street in Manhattan, Frank starts innovating. And one of the first things he does is that he is the first funeral chapel to offer processions with motorized hearses. In fact, he offered motorized hearses and limousines to carry the deceased. And this was like a really big deal. Up until this point, all hearses were carried in horse-drawn carriages. Like, even though cars had been invented, they were not used for funerals. It actually was considered obscene. And when Frank started using motorized hearses and limos, he got a lot of criticism and backlash because it was considered like very undignified to carry the deceased in a motorized car. It was like the devil's work, I guess. I'm not sure. I had no idea that this was the case until I started researching this video, but apparently very uncouth to use a car to carry your deceased. In fact, Frank was undeterred by the criticism, and he continues to innovate. And one of the other things he does is that he starts to advertise, which also had never been done when it comes to funerals and undertakers. I mean, this kind of is a result of like the Industrial Revolution, that like advertising in general really took off in this, like, you know, the 19-teens and the 1920s. So people were advertising all sorts of things that they would not have advertised in the past, but people were very put off by the fact that people were advertising funeral services because it had been such a private, kind of like spiritual thing for a lot of people and cultures. Like funerals and rituals around death are something that people take very seriously. And so the fact that people were advertising their funeral services put a lot of people off. But again, Frank does not care. So by 1915, Frank is so successful that he moves to a bigger funeral chapel on Broadway and East 66th Street in Manhattan. And he gets a reputation as basically being like the P.T. Barnum of the funeral world. It is a 3-ring circus all the time with Frank. And no stunt is beneath him. He would do like pretty wild things. He paid for someone's ashes to be scattered like via airplane over the Statue of Liberty. A woman called him at one point and she had lost her beloved pet canary, and she asked for Frank to embalm the pet canary so that she could keep it, and then when she died she wanted to be buried with her canary. And so he did that, and then when the woman actually died, he followed through. He buries her with the canary, and he made sure that this story got its way into the press. So he had a very keen eye for like what makes a good story, what sells newspapers, all about the clicks basically with Frank. So Frank is already kind of a master of publicity. He understands the game. And then in 1926, everything changes because Rudolph Valentino, the heartthrob of the silent film era, the Latin lover, dies tragically at age 31. And he was, they thought he had appendicitis. He was admitted to the hospital with appendicitis. He actually had like ruptured ulcers. And so he dies of sepsis, and it's this huge shock. And it's kind of the first time that like people flip out about a celebrity's death. Celebrity itself was kind of a new concept in the 1920s, because prior to that, you know, people were famous for achieving something, like authors or musicians or, you know, politicians, royalty, etc. People were famous for reasons. But then in the 1920s, cinema, and not to say that like movie stars didn't do something to be famous, but what I'm really trying to say is that like the moving image and photographs really took off, and print media took off. And so people actually felt a more personal connection to celebrities because they could see them as opposed to just reading their names. And so we really hadn't seen the public react to a celebrity's death like this before. And so Rudolph Valentino dies, and everyone is devastated, especially the ladies, because he was like the heartthrob. And Mr. Campbell has Valentino's body prepared for public viewing in the Gold Room, and he actually enlisted some women. He offered $1 to some like local ladies that were hanging out at the bars, like some barflies, to come to the funeral to like fill out the crowd. And there was absolutely no need for him to do that, because thousands of people, watched over by police officers on horseback, gathered outside of the funeral chapel. And when the doors opened, there was a stampede. Windows were shattered, brawls broke out, and people were trampled as mourners were fighting over souvenirs like flowers and strips of wallpaper from the funeral chapel. Like, these people went crazy over Valentino. An estimated 100,000 people lined the streets of Manhattan to pay their respects at this funeral, and suicides of fans were reported. One lady in London apparently fatally ingested poison surrounded by pictures of Valentino. Like, people really couldn't handle the fact that this happened. Frank actually hired 4 actors to impersonate fascist black shirts, like the fascist black shirt honor guards, and like said that they had been sent by Mussolini, which was a lie. And there was also a rumor that went around that the body that was on display was not actually Valentino's and was a decoy that Frank put out. That is unsubstantiated. I have no idea whether or not that's true, but lots of rumors flying around at Rudolph Valentino's funeral. On January 19th, 1934, Frank E. Campbell dies, and he passes away from heart disease. And oddly enough, in all of my research, I couldn't find any information about Frank E. Campbell's funeral. So I can only assume that he had it at Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel, but I don't know. I'm going to look it up again, and so maybe there will be like some sort of text happening right here where I can talk about Frank's funeral, but as of this recording, I don't know what happened. In 1938, Mr. Campbell's wife, Amelia, continues the family business, and it is still quite successful, and so she moves it to its final location where it is now on the Upper East Side. So Frank E. Campbell's continues to be the funeral chapel for the stars, and the next really big funeral happens on June 27th, 1969, when Judy Garland passes away. And we have spoken at length on this channel about Judy Garland and Judy Garland's funeral, but this really was a huge deal. Judy Garland passed away at age 47 from an overdose of barbiturates in the early morning hours. Judy Garland has her funeral on June 27th, and it's attended by thousands of people. People all over the world are affected by Judy Garland's death because it's tragic. And it becomes kind of this inflection point, not just for the wider culture, but specifically for the LGBTQ community, because there's this very interesting thing that happens. Judy Garland has her funeral June 27th, 1969 at Frank E. Campbell's, and all of the celebrities are there. Candy Darling is there, Warhol is there. Everyone is very affected by Judy's passing. And then in the early morning hours of June 27th, as it becomes June 28th, the Stonewall riots happen. And the police had raided the Stonewall Inn many times in the past, but a lot of people think that because the queer community was so affected by Judy's death, that when the police raid Stonewall, the queer community is like, we're not taking it anymore. Not today. Not on this day when Judy Garland has died. We will not stand for it. And so they fought back. And that is kind of like, a lot of people, there's no real way to prove it, but many people think that Judy's death had a very direct contribution to the Stonewall riots happening. And so Candy Darling and Andy Warhol are at Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel going to Judy's funeral. And then Holly Woodlawn, another Warhol superstar, is at the Stonewall Inn, like throwing the first brick with Marsha P. Johnson. So you can dig into all of these stories. I have videos about all of these people on my channel. But yeah, just another fun, interesting, like Warhol tie-in to the Frank E. Campbell's cinematic universe. Which brings me to the paparazzi and the code of silence at Frank E. Campbell's. The paparazzi are like an integral part of the Frank E. Campbell's experience. And to their credit, Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel takes their code of silence very seriously. So they have this kind of symbiotic relationship. It is tradition for the tabloids to send young reporters out to Frank E. Campbell's to stake out the funerals. They send people in the crowds, they try and get interviews. They're all about trying to get the story. And Frank E. Campbell's is very serious about getting them out. And so they always try to get in, the paparazzi, and Campbell's always, rejects them. But it is also important for the legacy of the deceased, in a lot of cases, to get the paparazzi photos. So you do want the paparazzi photos of these famous last images of the star, because it is the final show for these celebrities. That's why you have your funeral at Frank E. Campbell's, is to have some sort of control over your final image. And that's why the big stars go to Frank, is because they know that they will be able to control the way they are embalmed, the way the funeral happens, all of the different fancy add-ons that you can have for a funeral. Frank E. Campbell's will take care of it. And so it's like a rite of passage, if you are a certain kind of celebrity, to have your funeral at Frank's, and the media goes along with that. So you really do want the paparazzi to capture images from the funeral. But the inner workings of Frank E. Campbell's really is a mystery. The pallbearers, the embalmers, the service people, the doorman, everybody is sworn to a code of silence, and they take it extremely seriously. Mr. William Villanova, who is the president of Frank E. Campbell's since 2018, says that discretion is a crucial part of his job. We appreciate that people are curious, but privacy is our standard. People try. They sure do try. We've seen them hiding inside cars, behind trees, anything to get a glimpse. But I never discuss our clients. And even if you go to their website now, they make no mention of the fact that they are like the funeral service for the stars. They keep everything like very, very discreet. Just to touch on some notable funerals that kind of tie into my channel and the people that I typically talk about. In 1974, on March 21st, Candy Darling had her funeral at Frank E. Campbell's, which was, kind of this tragic full circle moment, because just a few years earlier, she had attended Judy Garland's funeral at Frank E. Campbell's with Andy Warhol. And when she passed away, I was very struck by her funeral, because her parents did not support her. If you don't know anything about Candy Darling was a Warhol superstar who was a trans woman, and she was one of the earliest trans women to have any sort of mainstream success. And you can barely call Warhol superstardom mainstream, especially in the 70s. It was very counterculture. But she was famous, and her family, her mother and father, were divorced, and neither of them really supported her being trans, especially her dad. And despite the estrangement, when Candy died, the doctors at the hospital she was at, she passed away from complications from the hormones she was taking. They actually caused cancer. And so Candy Darling dies tragically young, partly due to the fact that she was taking hormone therapy, which is not what hormone therapy does now. This was very early experimental days of hormone therapy. But she passes away, and the doctors recommend this funeral chapel for like basically street people. It was like where you send the homeless people when they die at the hospital. That is the funeral chapel the doctors recommended for Candy Darling. And even though her parents were divorced, they didn't like each other, and they were kind of estranged from Candy, they together decided that they wanted Candy to have her funeral at Frank E. Campbell's, in part because that's where Judy Garland had her funeral. And so Candy Darling had her funeral at Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel, and it was a huge deal. I mean, it wasn't as well attended as Judy's, but it was extremely well attended by very prominent people in New York City. Giorgio de Sant'Angelo donated a gown, and Vidal Sassoon sent a wig, and it was an extremely beautiful funeral. And outside, this is heartbreaking, but at the time, the streets were lined with what were called street queens, trans women and drag queens of the era, who lined the streets outside of Candy Darling's funeral, but did not dare enter because they were afraid that they would not be welcomed, which just breaks my heart. But it just kind of falls in line of this tradition of like people gathering outside of Frank E. Campbell's when somebody important or famous or prominent in some way dies. It's very interesting to me. 1980, John Lennon is assassinated tragically outside of the Dakota in the Upper West Side, and he has his funeral at Frank E. Campbell's. And what's very interesting is that the Frank E. Campbell's team actually arranged a decoy hearse to like divert attention from the paparazzi so they could get the body in. On August 12th of 1988, Jean-Michel Basquiat died at the age of 27 from a heroin overdose. He also had his funeral at Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel. I don't think Warhol attended the funeral. I don't think Warhol attended any funerals, I'm pretty sure. I know that he did not attend Candy Darling's funeral. So I'm curious if Andy Warhol ever went to a Frank E. Campbell's funeral service. I guess I know he went to the one for Judy Garland with Candy Darling, but he did not. He hated death and he hated attending funerals, so I doubt he was there much. If I can make an educated guess about Andy Warhol, I know that he probably wasn't there a lot. In 1994, Jackie Kennedy Onassis passed away, and somebody from Frank E. Campbell's actually slipped through the crowd outside of her building and snuck up to her apartment and embalmed her in her own home so that they didn't have to like try to sneak her body to the funeral chapel. And so Frank E. Campbell's continues to be just the go-to place for the stars to have their final bow, to take their final bow in front of the press and the public. And at this point, they are renowned for their ability to go above and beyond. And the amenities and service portfolio that they offer is ridiculous. You can even have Frank E. Campbell's cremate your body, pack your ashes into the shape of a starfish, and place you on the ocean floor on a reef outside of Miami. They actually own a segment of the reef where they put people's starfish-shaped ashes. You can also have your ashes blasted into outer space if you would like. They will arrange that for you. The description of this service notes that, quote, "There's no more compelling send-off for someone who loves science fiction, marvels at space, or simply longs to be at one with the cosmos." That's me. You get the coordinates of where you'll be sent into space, and then they send you up in a rocket. And this costs, I mean, I don't know how much the space stuff costs, but the general services can range anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000, but truly, money is no object. They will do, if you have the funds, they will do pretty much whatever you want. So researching this video was very fun and interesting, and I dug up just kind of a lot of random tidbits. One of them is that there was this incident involving a man who passed away, who was very wealthy, who was a cheater, a philanderer, and two different women called to make arrangements for this man's funeral because both of these women thought that they were the main woman in his life. And so Frank E. Campbell's discreetly arranged for there to be 2 funeral services for the 2 different parties involved in this gentleman's love life. That was very interesting to me. Also, another huge part of like the funeral ecosystem is the funeral crashers. And apparently there are a number of people who take funeral crashing very seriously, and they consider Frank E. Campbell's to be like the top prize for funeral crashing. And part of it is like this compulsion to savor this cross between like fame and death. It's like this kind of intoxicating scenario. So these voyeurs become like very well known in the funeral community. And the most accomplished funeral crasher is this man named Richard Osterweil, who is a 71-year-old painter who at this point has crashed hundreds of funerals at Frank E. Campbell's. And he says that when he is at Frank E. Campbell's, he is the observer watching the elite. This guy even has a favorite pew at Frank E. Campbell's. It is the 6th from the front on the far left. And he recalled getting kicked out of the funeral for New York hotel magnate Leona Helmsley in 2007, which he said was ironic because I crashed the service of her husband, Harry Helmsley, years earlier, and I thought that she and I had really bonded. Crazy. And he says that although he believes that Frank E. Campbell's is the ultimate resting place for the celebrities, he does not think that he will have his funeral there because it's just not to his taste. It's a bit too exclusive for him. Another fun fact that I learned in researching this video was that William Villanova, who is the current funeral director at Frank's, was the consultant on HBO's Succession when the character Logan Roy died. Sorry, spoiler alert, he dies. And of course, Logan Roy would have his funeral at Frank E. Campbell's, and William Villanova actually appears as the funeral director on Succession. So I thought that was like a very interesting touch that the show did that, because before making this video, I would have never known that that was an important funeral chapel, but it shows that they like really know their stuff and they really pay attention to detail, because Logan Roy absolutely would have his funeral at Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel. Speaking of notoriety, Frank's has handled some very notorious funerals. Jeffrey Epstein had his funeral at Frank E. Campbell's, as did Frank Costello, who was a very famous mob boss. And Mr. Villanova says that we do not judge the dead. Maybe the public saw someone in a certain way, but to someone else, that was their father or their mother. We see the grandchildren crying. Are we aware of what's happening with certain clients outside in the media? Of course we are, but everyone is entitled to grieve and mourn. And I also thought that was an interesting facet of the funeral world. I honestly had not given the world of funerals too much thought prior to this video, and I don't consider myself like a very morbid person, but I do think I have kind of a spooky side, and there is something macabre to my sensibilities and to the videos that I make here and the stories that I'm interested in. And so it was very fascinating for me to go down this rabbit hole and learn about the funeral world. And I want to end this video on just kind of a short list of the many different famous people that have had their funerals at Frank's. And the list includes, but is not limited to, Aaliyah, Elizabeth Arden, Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, Lauren Bacall, George Balanchine, Jean-Michel Basquiat, Irving Berlin, Montgomery Clift, Walter Cronkite, Joan Crawford, Jean Eagles, Greta Garbo, George Gershwin, Leslie Gore, Rita Hayworth, William Randolph Hearst Jr., Jim Henson, Philip Seymour Hoffman, Peter Jennings, Jiggly Caliente, Madeline Kahn, Robert F. Kennedy, Heath Ledger, John Lennon, Ethel Merman, Mary Tyler Moore, the Notorious B.I.G., among many, many others. And I want to end this video with this fun anecdote. So this video has been many weeks in the making. If you've been following my channel, you have seen me mention that I have been thinking of making this video. And I recently went to a girls' weekend with some friends, and it was a bunch of people that I hadn't seen in a long time. And I wore this Andy Warhol sweatshirt, and my friends were like, "Oh, is that merch for your channel?" And I was like, "No, I got this sweatshirt at the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh," which you should go to if you are interested in Andy Warhol, and you can get there. Very good museum. But I was like, "No, this is not merch for the channel." But I was like, I do want to make merch. I want to make a shirt that says "Bury me at Frankie Campbell's." And so I was telling them the story of like why I wanted to make this shirt. And then later at the end of the weekend, we were watching The First Wives Club, which I had never seen. And if you don't know, spoiler alert, the movie starts with a character committing suicide. And the rest of the characters, Diane Keaton and Goldie Hawn and Bette Midler, they meet, they're all like college girlfriends, and they meet at this funeral for their college friend who had committed suicide, Stockard Channing. And as the camera is panning to the funeral scene, I was like, oh my God, is it? Is it gonna be? And sure enough, it is Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel. And we're all like, ah, like screaming, because they all knew that I was really into Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel. So it just was like the most random piece of media. It just was, you know, one of those things where like once you notice something, then you see it everywhere. I am seeing Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel everywhere. So that is the end of this video, a random deep dive into the strange world of funerals and funerals for celebrities. I hope you liked this. I hope it was worth the wait. I know that I have been kind of missing in action lately because I've just got a lot going on. So, and I'm trying to get my show off the ground still, and I'm doing astrology, and I'm working, and, you know, doing this channel. Oh, but I did actually end up making the shirt. So I went on to Spring, which is like a site that you can make merch, and I designed myself a little Frankie Campbell's Funeral Chapel shirt. So if you would like to purchase that, the link will hopefully be below if I can figure out how to make that happen. So yay, what a weird video. So thank you for watching. If you made it to the end of the video, leave me a little skull emoji in the comments to let me know you made it this far. And I so appreciate you watching. Please hit subscribe if you haven't for more weird, morbid content about stars. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.